Hello, and welcome to the On Books podcast. This week, I'm really excited to bring you this book that I have right here, Bird by Anne Lamott. I just finished this book, and I found it deeply inspiring, and there's lots of underlining. I underlined it a lot and made notes and a lot of good stuff in here. It's a short book, about 200 pages. It has pretty damn good reviews on the Amazon. About 1,300 people gave it, has a 73%. Not that that matters too much, but just to give you some sense. And it came out in the mid-90s, around 1995. So in this episode, as we usually do, we're going to look at some highlights up front. Then I'm going to do a reading from the book. I'll read you some of my favorite takeaways. And I'll give you some final thoughts just on how I came to the book, how I think it compares to a dozen or so other writing books that I've read. And yeah, they'll help you walk away with making the decision. Should you read it, or did you maybe get enough highlights from this episode, hopefully, to help you with your writing or life, or even just, I think if you like to read, I think this is a good book because it's so fun and readable, and her prose is just so, I don't know, empathetic and engaging that I think you walk away, or I walked away with some fresh eyes on even skills on reading, which isn't something we talk about so much, how do you become a better reader? But all of that is in here, and so let's get started right now. Now, you might be wondering why it's called Bird by Bird. What do birds have to do with writing? The book's fairly autobiographical. She talks a lot about her father, who was a writer who she was deeply influenced and inspired by. And the title Bird by Bird comes from something that he had said when giving some writing advice to her brother back when she was growing up. She writes, 30 years ago, my older brother, who was 10 years old at the time, was trying to get a report on birds written that he'd had 3 months to write. It was due the next day. We were out at our family cabin in Bolinas, and he was at the kitchen table close to tears, surrounded by binder paper and pencils and unopened books on birds. He was immobilized by the hugeness of the task ahead. Then my father sat down beside him, put his arm around my brother's shoulder, and said, "Bird by bird, buddy. Just take it bird by bird." From there, the book starts with one of the hardest parts of writing, which is getting started. And her advice on this, one of the things she starts with is just this idea of short assignments. And there's a chapter on short assignments, which is just start bird by bird. Start with something simple. Maybe, for example, just write a page of something, or write just a character description. Like, make it easy on yourself. She writes, often when you sit down to write, what you have in mind is an autobiographical novel of your childhood, or a play about the immigrant experience, or a history of, say, women, right? So she's pointing out here that, often we have these kind of grand and abstract or big ideas that we sit down with, and then nothing comes out, and we beat ourselves up. And we, as she writes, she says, I make a few phone calls, and then I think about all the other people that I haven't called back in a while, right? And then you get derailed. I can really speak from experience of how hard it is to sit down and actually do the work. So she's basically, in this chapter of just 3 or 4 pages here, she's like, just give yourself a short assignment and focus on one thing and just do it bird by bird. The book is divided. This first part 1 is about writing, and she tackles things like plot, character, dialogue, the things you might expect from a writing book. Although she does it in this kind of way of sharing these anecdotes, and she has her own kind of funny, like ways and puns and assignments that she gives you along the way. So it's not as academic as it is, like I said, autobiographical and almost, like a memoir. It's fun. It's fun to read. One of the last things that she, so after we get through all of that and we get through the things that get in your way of writing, all this kind of stuff, publications and getting publishing is just a few pages at the end, just a few short chapters. So I mentioned that because it's almost a theme that she brings up a lot, that there's a lot of writers out there who don't actually want to write. They just want to be published. And she's saying, what, this book isn't really about getting published. This book is about getting your butt in the chair and doing the same thing every day, which is writing. During an NPR interview from just a few years ago, she said, You never wait for inspiration. It's ridiculous. It will never come. No one in your family is going to hope for you to be a writer. It's not convenient for you to write. You have to do it, and you have to do it badly. So that brings us to our first reading here. Just this idea of writing these short assignments, doing it badly. And this chapter, which is chapter 3, I believe, is called Shitty First Drafts. And I'm sharing this with you because I found it pretty inspiring. Just this idea of like having the permission to just write something that's going to suck and just be a shitty first draft. She coined that term as far as I know. So let me read to you here from this chapter, Shitty First Drafts, to get a sense of this assignment that she gives us and her style and sense of writing. I think you're really going to enjoy it. So here you go, Shitty First Drafts. Now, practically even better news than that short assignment is the idea of the shitty first draft. All good writers write them. This is how they end up with good second drafts and terrific third drafts. People tend to look at successful writers who are getting their books published and maybe even doing well financially, and they think that they sit down at their desks every morning feeling like $1 million, feeling great about who they are and how much talent they have and, well, what a great story they have to tell. That they take in a few deep breaths, push their sleeves back, roll their necks a few times to get out all the cricks, and dive in, typing fully formed passages as fast as a court reporter. But this is just the fantasy of the uninitiated. I know some very great writers you love, writers who write beautifully and have made a great deal of money. And not one of them sits down routinely feeling wildly enthusiastic and confident. Not one of them writes elegant first drafts. All right, one of them does. But we don't like her very much. We don't think she has the same rich inner life or that God could even stand her. Although, when I mentioned this to my friend Tom, my priest friend, he said, you could safely assume you've created God in your own image when it turns out that God hates all the same people you do. But very few writers really know what they're doing until they've done it. Nor do they go about their business feeling dewy and thrilled. One writer I know tells me that he sits down every morning and says to himself, very nicely, he says, it's not like you don't have a choice, because you do. You can either type or kill yourself. Skipping ahead to the next page, she just goes through this story about how hard it is to rein herself in and just get typing. It's hard to just make my fingers move, she writes. She just goes through, how painful and how she self-doubts herself. And just to contrast this, at other parts of the book, she marvels at how beautiful and how important writing is. She does think that writing is, as she says, it's about telling the truth and it helps you understand who you are. It's about helping yourself pay attention to what's going on in the world, right? But in this chapter, it's all that other voice that's saying, I know, writing is beautiful. I love books. I love all this stuff. But in this chapter, it's like, yeah, and this shit is really hard. That's where we are with this chapter. So skipping ahead, she goes through the story of how hard it is and then begins to share her idea for you about writing shitty first drafts. So she comes at it like this. She says on page 25, almost all good writing begins with terrible first efforts. But you need to start somewhere. So start by getting anything down on paper. And now I just numbered the steps here. So she's going to give us some steps for the first drafts that we should do. So number 1, a friend of mine says the first draft is the down draft. You just get it down. Number 2, so after that, the second draft is the up draft. You fix it up. You say what you have to say and you try to do it a little more accurately. So now we're on the third draft. So we're talking about the same thing we're writing. The third draft is what she calls the dental draft, where you check every tooth to see if it's loose, cramped, decayed, or, God help us, healthy. Maybe it's a good draft, if we're lucky. What I've learned to do when I sit down to work on a shitty first draft is to quiet the voices in my head. First, there's the vinegar-lipped reader lady who says primly, well, that's not very interesting at all, is it? And there's the emaciated German Mal who writes these Orwellian memos detailing your thought crimes. And there are your parents agonizing over your lack of loyalty and discretion, and there's William Burroughs dozing off or shooting up because he finds you as bold and articulate as a houseplant, and so on and so on. All right, so that's Anne Lamott's idea of shitty first drafts. Hopefully that was helpful to you, inspiration that you can You can join the ranks of writers like Anne Lamott, who's written more than a dozen books and is an amazing writer. I mean, just reading this, you can tell, by joining her terrifying league of people who write shitty first drafts and are terrified to sit down and actually write. It was quite cathartic and empathetic for me to read that, to kind of feel, oh man, she gets this. Or maybe even for me it was, oh, maybe there's something on the other side of all this shit that I'm writing. So that was really good. I want to share with you now that I've read a little bit from the book, just kind of how I arrived at the book, because it might be helpful to you if you are seeking to become a better writer or to write anything in the first place. I had read about, oh man, like I feel like I've read at least 24 writing books, and I mean, some of them have really worked and have been inspiring. I'll name some, like Robert McKee's Story is a good book on writing story. Mary Oliver has a poetry handbook. There's Elements of Style, this classic Strunk and White about grammar and sentence structure, as well as books that we've covered on this podcast. We talked about the Writing Tools book from Roy Peter Clark. All of these were helpful in some regard, especially in the ones I've mentioned, in the technical formation of writing stories and writing sentences. And when this book was recommended to me, I thought, okay, another writing book. My writing coach had recommended it to me. I have over the past year found that I work really well with deadlines. So I got an editor / writing coach who I meet with once a week. And I have to submit something every Tuesday, and it gets reviewed, and I get feedback on it, and we talk about it for an hour. And I found that is a little bit of my kind of missing energy of getting these shitty first drafts out, is like having a deadline for somebody to read them. So take that. Maybe that's helpful to you. And you can apply that also to any new skill that you're trying to learn. I find that having a deadline for me, I mean, let me tell you, so many Monday nights now, I don't go out, and I will, this is embarrassing almost, but I have spent so many Monday nights up until 6 a.m. Writing, knowing that at 8, but I have to do it 8 a.m. on Tuesday, so don't call me on Monday night to hang out. But there's no other way in the world that I would begin staying up till 6 a.m. on a Monday, all night, and just ruining my Tuesday basically. But, with that kind of pressure, other than giving it to myself. And so that's been really helpful. And, about a few weeks in, she thought that I was being a little precious with my writing, and self-doubting it and stuff. And so she introduced this idea to me, my writing coach, of the shitty first draft, and told me to read this book. And I was so delighted, reading this book, because it's really fresh, a really fresh take, as you can tell from Anne Lamott's experience that she shares, that I felt really stood out in comparison to all these other writing books that I mentioned. So I would say if you've read The Artist's Way, or if we've talked about that on this podcast as well in a previous episode, it's a little bit more like that. It's a little bit more inspiration, but maybe where The Artist's Way is inspiration and all these other books are technical writing books, this is somewhere in between. It's like it's gotten me writing, and it's pushed me, and you learn some tips along the way. So I found that really helpful. All right. So this has been another episode of the On Books podcast. I hope you enjoyed this reading from Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott. If you like audiobooks, this is available as an audiobook. She doesn't read it, which is, I always love when the authors read it, but it's pretty good. I've checked it out. The book itself is about 200 pages. I'll put links and show notes and all that kind of stuff at on-books.com. My email address, if you have any questions, suggestions, things you're wondering, you could reach me at chris@on-books.com. And I also teach online. I have a lot of courses that I teach people how to code, teach about Bitcoin, Ethereum, technology, digital literacy. All this stuff is available in video form. Yeah, you get to look at me and say, hey, what's up in the comments, on onemonth.com, and you can join the 1 month membership there and see me there, as well as on YouTube. And there's about 50 episodes of this podcast as well, which are also on iTunes, Spotify, wherever. There's just so much stuff out there. Guys, I'm making a lot of stuff. So check it out. Let me know what you think. Hopefully it's helpful to you. That's why I make it, and it's fun for me to do as well. All right. Have a great week. Peace out. Bye.